Welcome to the Lean Focus Podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of lean transformation with your host, Damon Baker.
John, Magnum has been one of the great American manufacturing success stories. 30 years of steady growth, becoming the largest producer of magnets in the U.S. and expanding into adjacent markets like tapes, films, and coatings. But by the time you arrived, growth had plateaued. There wasn't a crisis, just a sense that the business was coasting on its legacy. Can you take us back to that moment, and what did you walk into?
Sure. So there's three different divisions, as you note: the magnet, the tape and film, the inks and coatings. And magnet was really the foundation. The company was founded over 30 years ago. Really strong market share, really strong performance. One of the challenges is that the previous leader of the company had passed away a couple of years ago, and he was a very close friend of the owners, had been with the business 10 or 12 years, a pillar in the community. And so, quite frankly, there was a lot of grieving going on kind of at the ownership level and within the business itself, with that impactful leader having had a tragic exit from the business, right? So really, the business was okay, was doing all right, just really the eye taken off the ball in terms of growth. And it just took some time for everybody to get their wits back about them and say, okay, we're ready to go on this next chapter now. Really a focus. They need to be a growth business. That was the legacy. That was going to be the future. They had made some investments. They didn't really have clarity on where to go, how to get there. Really looking for a 10x magnitude growth in these growth areas where they were getting decent growth, but just not at that level.
When you were doing your diligence to join the company, what did you see in the makeup or the DNA about the business that gave you some confidence that this business could climb higher?
You know, that really comes down to the culture, right? And you can only kind of get so much out of an interview process and out of those conversations, of course. But it was an extended process. I spent 6 months getting to know the ownership and learning about the business. And there's really two key components of their culture, right? They were really big on learning their why some years ago, back to the Simon Sinek book and that mindset. And they had some real clarity in their why and their how, right? Forge a world-class example, inspiring people to compete and succeed, right? And how do they do that? The mantra is around empowering our people, communicating so people understand, inspiring innovation, sticking together. This notion that we want the ball, meaning people want to get involved in problems. People want to be the ones that are turned to when times are tough. And so when you have that foundation in your culture, you'd probably agree, but you're starting in a position of power, a position of strength. And so I was confident that with their past success and with those pillars of the culture, that we could do some pretty wonderful things here.
I think building on that foundation, I think it's easy for people to rally around this idea of a turnaround because you're mired in crisis, and it's almost like we have a shared situation we're all trying to climb out of at the same time. But I think it's much harder to come into a business when things aren't in a crisis mode, when things actually look fine. So Magnum was performing well on pretty much every operational metric, but the board wanted a plan to reignite growth. So that was really the wake-up call when the board started to realize that the success that they've experienced in the past was starting to slow down, and it wasn't a given that it would continue. How did you build that sense of urgency in the organization when there really wasn't that burning platform of a crisis to rally around?
And as I think about that and kind of reflect on it and reflect on our culture, we like to have fun. We like to compete. I kind of liken it, for anybody that has kids, to the Triwizard Tournament in Harry Potter, right? if you're walking around the outside, it just looks like this beautiful English garden, these perfectly manicured hedges. All indications are everything is fine. But really, in there is quite a maze, right? And you got to convince people to come into that maze with you. You have to help them realize what's the prize at the end of that maze. Not everybody's going to be willing to go with you. And we had some of that. Some people really want to go with you and they join the business. And once you're in there, you're navigating that. And there's a wave of challenges you can't necessarily foresee, but you have to be in there with them, right? You have to be behind them, helping them through, going back when they're falling behind, not always leading from the front, so to speak. And so that was a big part of it, and really understanding, where are they really strong? Where is the team already going well that, me being there isn't going to add the most value? And where are the areas that they're struggling to engage on? And so a lot of one-on-ones with people, really understanding authentically where they're at in that maze. Do they understand where or why we're going? Where are we going to go? And we had a lot more questions than answers, right? And so getting curious about where the potential was as well. And it was really around developing this strategic plan as a group, really going through and saying, okay, what are our capabilities? What are the emerging technologies? What does the market need? That was my part of figuring that out. That was my wrestling match through that maze while supporting everybody else. And it was really, really quite a year in terms of navigating that. We feel like we can see the prize now, and we're all aligned to going to get it. And now we're getting into this push, and that is one of the hardest parts there. But at least we all know where we're trying to go together.
Yeah. Aside from using the Harry Potter's wizard sorting hat to figure out what house people belong to before they would join you in the maze, what else stood out as the hard part of getting people motivated when historical performance looked so strong? Was there any convincing that had to be done? Did people get dragged kicking, screaming?
So it's around building trust and engagement, right? And there is no shortcut to that. You also can't rush that, right? And how do you do that? You do that one on one. I do it a lot over lunches, over meals. But really understanding the background of where has the business been, where does ownership want it to go, where have the folks that have been in the business a short or a long time, what's their perspective on what's going well, what isn't, and then sharing my perspectives, my experiences on what we might do, and helping shape that through a lot of questions. There's really two key things that I try to get across to folks. And in that process of building trust, the first thing I always observe is that people are resistant to change. And why are they resistant to change? More often than not, it's because a new person comes in. I am a change agent, and it's perceived as an indictment on the past. We didn't do well enough, therefore somebody else is going to come in and help us figure out what we're supposed to do. And that's not the case. That's never the case. I always liken it to take the top performing company in 1985 and assume you did nothing different today, right? Your customer service group FedExing airplane tickets and working over fax. And so it's laughable, but change doesn't happen in 40, 50-year increments. It happens daily, right? So take that down from 40 years to 5 years to 1 year to 2 quarters to 2 weeks. You have to change just because the environment shifts around you. And so helping them realize that, look, this is not about what we did in the past wasn't right. We built a fantastic organization, a highly profitable business. What we're looking at is where we're trying to go, and recognizing that we're going to need to mix some things up to get there faster and better than anybody else does. And so take what worked in the past. Let's not lose that, but let's be open to new ways of getting there. And once people's guards come down and they understand that, oh, this isn't about me, It's not about what we did in the past. It's about where we're going. Now they're curious. Where are we going? How do I have to change to get there? What do I need to do different? That's the engagement, and that's the trust building when you break those walls down.
Yeah. I want to expand upon that point, the clarity of where you're going. I think of that as the visioning exercise or strategy deployment. You said the biggest challenge wasn't resistance in the people itself, but it was the clarity that the organization had about its direction setting, which I think that fits in what you just talked about. The plus side is the stability that Magnum had experienced historically gave you the cover fire to be able to listen, the time, so to speak, but also made it harder to find sort of the edges to get your fingers around in the problem, right? Because there was nothing truly broken. So what were, in your mind, some of the early signs that Magnum's growth engine was starting to run out of runway?
We were in the classic case of shiny object syndrome, right? So this is going to happen, that's going to happen, and then you look 2 months later and, well, no, those went away, but now we have these next things that are going to be really good. And so, especially the newer parts of the business, when you start a new business, you are a little opportunistic and you are a little scrappy, right? That's kind of the nature of it. Um, and that's why so many companies, right, $0 to $2 million is kind of the first phase. Getting your business from 2 to 10 or from 10 to 50, right? There's pretty big inflection points. And that's where we were in this business is, oh, okay, we're at this, call it, 2 to 10 range. How do we get 10 to 50? We need to have a lot more clarity and confidence in what we can do and how we're going to get there than we do today. And that requires a depth of analysis on the strategic planning side, market segmentation, VOC around your technology and your technology partners, around your customers and applications. What's going to make that shift and why? To build the confidence in the team that we have a path to get there. And then from there, what are the things we need to say no to in order to do that? And we're kind of in the mix of that now. If we believe in those and we're going to do those, we need to stop doing this and start doing that. And as most people know, saying no is really hard, especially when you're in a growth phase, right? And so that discipline requires a degree of confidence and engagement that you can't shortcut. You're either aligned and you have the support to get there or not. You also have to have the humility to say, look, this is what we think right now, but we're going to have to test this every quarter and make sure we're still on track, because if we're wrong, we want to fail fast and move forward. And so also the acknowledgement that we're not locked in. Yes, this is where we're going and why. We have to say no to these things, but also the humility to say, I might be wrong. And if I am, or things might change amid our strategy, how do we adapt to that? And being in a company this size, we're a lot more agile that way. We're able to do that in a way that the market values and recognizes, and that's what we're running with.
I think what's unique about your story is the fact that not only did you have to rally the employees inside the organization who had experienced all that success historically, but then you had to engage the leadership team and the board around that new sense of direction and clarity and vision. And that can be a daunting task for most CEOs coming in an organization. Oftentimes that's where it falls apart, is when you have to take that next step where the team has done its work to align, but now you got to take that to the board and to the owners, and it could all fall apart. And I've oftentimes seen CEOs walk out because they didn't get that partnership. But in your case, it was the opposite. You actually credited Magnum's owners and board for being incredible partners, helping you to understand the culture and how the business was built while pushing you to evolve it. So they were there almost as a cheerleader. They wanted the same thing. So what have you learned as a result of that experience from those owners about stewardship of a company and sustainability of a company for the long term?
The kind of the eye opener here for me was that, I'm an engineer underneath, right? I'm used to trusting the data, following the data, and once the puzzle seems to make sense, then looking up and saying, okay, what assumptions are coming out of this? What's right? What isn't? And going back in. And what I luckily, when I entered this role, I really made the commitment to myself to listen a lot for the first quarter and really make no big decisions that affected people, that affect, things that would be felt by the organization. It was all around kind of forming and synthesizing what the key elements of that strat plan might be, of what the growth direction might be. And what I realized in that process, doing that more effective than I'd done in the past, is there were things that I learned and figured out that I could never have gotten to on my own. That logic would never have taken me there.
Such as?
So one great example was around, we have a set of employees that have been here for the whole 30 years. Whether it's through recognition or compensation or the open door policy on who you would talk to at the executive level and engage. If you just walk cold into a manufacturing company, you might look at an org chart and assume different pieces of information come from different roles, different functions in the business. You might assume your engagement as an executive with a certain part of the business is going to look like X and another part like Y. As I really listened and got a sense of not where the position power lied, but where the knowledge power really lied in the organization, where the influence and potential resistance to change was really going to lie if those knowledge people weren't on board, it would have maybe not gone as quickly or as smoothly as it has the first year. And I understood that in the past, but never actually embraced it and operationalize it as quickly as we did here. And I just learned a tremendous amount. Learned a tremendous about how to adapt my leadership style in certain areas. I think the perception of me as a leader here is a bit different than it was in other businesses, just because of how I've approached it and therefore how I've evolved and helped the business evolve as a result of that.
Yeah, you're making me reflect now. I think I've had similar experiences, and I think in smaller companies, it's easier to find because the number of people that you're dealing with obviously is less, right? And you don't have these formal hierarchical structures and things like that. But the truth is, it exists in big companies too. And I remember a particular time, Danaher business, where there was one of those people that you just described who didn't have the title, but everybody viewed this person as one of the most important people inside the entire organization. He was the brainchild behind the core technology that went into the instrumentation that they sold, and everybody worshipped the ground that he walked on, and he was an informal decision maker. So that's a great lesson, and one that I think a lot of people should take to heart for sure. So now you're at the point of no return, right? So you're beyond analysis phase, and now you're going to start shooting some live fire bullets down the range. So you're committing to growth. So you said you were all in from day one when you signed. You already committed to the change. What was the first major step or action that you took to drive an incremental improvement inside the business?
So it's probably going to sound fundamental and small, maybe something that close to your heart, however, in the role that you do. But, when I joined, one of the things that has existed was this notion of a weekly report. And this was a communication to the ownership on how the business did each week, what the challenges are, what was going. It was cumbersome. There was one person pulling it together. It probably took 20 to 25% of their time. And there were almost no numbers. It was words. And what was reported was what people wanted to report at that amount of time, which by nature is going to be good news.
A lot of filtering.
A lot of filtering, and it could vary week to week. And then when it went up, the people reading it had certain questions about what they knew about the business. Invariably, what they were looking for wasn't there. And then there was a whole bunch of follow-up in recycling, which had a degree of frustration, etc. So it looked like poor communication, but really wrapped up in this trust, this concern, and lack of direction around what to report. At the same time, the business has a tremendous amount of data in its arsenal. It tracks and measures everything. So it wasn't so much that the information wasn't available, it was just that it was broken. And literally within the course of the first 3 to 4 weeks, really dialing in on, look, what information is important. And to some degree from the bottoms up on my end, right? Sales funnel size and year over year sales trends, all the run charts associated with it, operations, SQDIP, right? NPD, key project status, things of that nature. But getting that into a single page update with plenty of detail if somebody wants to go deep, but exactly what was being looked for, data driven on exactly how things were going with a few words to provide context, made a tremendous amount of difference. And now everybody probably puts in 25 minutes a week. I put in 1 to 2 hours a week, but I can get in that small amount of time an entire synthesis on the operation of the business each week. And one of the things that came back to me, it was a small comment in a staff meeting, but it meant a lot to me, was, well, nobody here now can say that we don't have good communication and don't understand where the business is, because all you have to do is look at this and it's pretty clear where we're at any given time and where we need to focus to go forward. And so taking that off has provided other insight for everybody. They feel much freer to go work on what they need to do and not figure out what they should say and then respond when they don't say the right thing. It was very freeing and really delivered a lot of energy to the group to then start to focus on what we needed to do going forward. And for me, it was a big trust builder because people realized that he can kind of take the cover on some of that. That's really all I have to do, and I can go focus on the more meaningful things.
Yeah, I don't want to understate how important that is. You described it as simple, but it's not simple for a lot of reasons. And I know you're being a little humble when you say that, but that in itself is a cultural transformation as well. If you think about creating transparency around what winning looks like inside the business and then presenting that in a way, with a cadence that's consistent across the organization, it sets the stage for a lot of what's going to come next. And I'm sure you know that, right? We don't know where we're going to go if we don't know where we are and whether we're winning or losing against a standard. And I think what you lacked was a lot of clarity around where we're winning, where we're losing, and what those standards are. And it's kind of brilliant how you did it. You did it in a way that wasn't a lean rollout. It wasn't a big pronouncement. It wasn't a sophisticated exercise. It was slowly shifting the organization towards that behavior of seeking the truth, speaking the truth. So now you're building the momentum. You've already said that the organization you walked into has tremendous technical excellence, a loyal customer base, stable operations, but you needed sharper focus and more organizational capability to scale that. So in this phase, how did you decide what it was you were going to keep, what you're going to fix, and what you're going to let go of inside of Magnum?
In that case, what we were going to keep was the culture of easy to work with. We move fast. We provide customer and market-centric solutions, right? So people come to us when they need something and they get it faster than they get from anyone else. That was a good kind of alignment point for me in ownership when I came in, because that's exactly how I've always behaved in my entire career. Is the first one that comes to the customer, the market, with a solution that works has a higher likelihood of winning.
Yeah, speed wins every
always
time.
win, but you win a lot more than others do. Your batting average goes way, way up. And so our ability to understand what customers need and deliver that faster than anybody else is, in the simplest form, all we do. And keeping that is what I really latched onto. What to fix? We follow the data. Again, I got a great team. There's plenty of data available. Dial in on the 10 or 12 KPIs that really matter, not the 50 or the 100, but the ones that really matter. Once a month, testing our ops review. Okay, what are the actions that we're doing to get there? Where are we tripping up? Where do we need help? But, always opportunity to get better, but a pretty good foundation to build on there. What we really needed to fix was where we were aiming the resources for growth. I felt like I took a risk on this one. We had some market research work that we had done. We had some VOC. We had gone to a number of shows, and we had a sense of where the markets, the applications, the segments were. And we really went all in. And I worked with a couple people on my team that I had confidence really were close enough and had the networks and the connections to pressure test and do this, and iterated a number of times. Again, this is something in the past I probably would have grabbed it myself sooner because I felt like it could have gone more efficiently. But I really made the conscious effort to coach through that and challenge and let one or two particular individuals really wrestle and get a little frustrated and come back a couple times. And doing that paid dividends. It delivered results that I don't think I would personally have been capable of delivering, to be honest with you. I've never delivered that quality in the past. Once we had that source information, I was really able to add value by synthesizing and bringing that together into hypotheses, right? This is where we think. The risk was going back to a couple of key partners and kind of opening the closet door a little bit and saying, this is what we're thinking, where we're looking to go. Do you think we're on the right track? And we did that with two really key partners, and it turned out to be brilliant because the result was, yes, with the level of precision of information we gave them, which was not terribly precise, it was extremely well aligned to where they were. So we got the validation from multiple external market points that our strategy and their strategy were founded in the same principles and assumptions, and we knew how to test those. So that was incredibly confidence building for the team. The second was these companies that were a magnitude bigger than us looked at what we were able to do, knowing that I had only been there 6 months in the team, and were kind of in awe at what we were able to do and understand as well or better than they were able to do with much larger departments, and had a significant impact on where we sit in their tier of partners going forward for growth opportunities. And so it became a real enabler to some of these fundamental partnerships in these segments where we want to grow by building credibility and building trust with some of these key partners in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is your strategic plan. And to me, this is test day, right? This is the big test and how you validate the strategic plan. And quite frankly, and I'm sure you've experienced this multiple times, a lot of organizations design the perfect strategic plan on paper, but do few, if anything, to validate their hypotheses and test that with customers and eat their own cooking, so to speak. So I want to spend a little time on that because you really did pressure test the strategic plan quite thoroughly. You didn't just make assumptions. You invited criticism from trusted partners, such as your customers, as you pointed out, which then also had the dual benefit of not only strengthening your strategy, but strengthening your relationship with those customers because you were communicating them with in a different way. And I think that's a 2-for-1 that you got as a result of that. So in your view, just kind of talking to the audience, like in your experience, why is that external validation process so important to having a sound strategic plan?
Well, it's twofold. One, back to the earlier point, things change. And sometimes they change really fast, and sometimes they don't. But you want to start with the assumption that they're going to change fast and disprove it rather than assume they're not going to change and get surprised, right? And so you need to have that curiosity. But the second is when it kind of becomes personal, right? If you allow it to become you as a person, I should say for me, right? If I allow initiative, if I take that personally and say, if this doesn't succeed, I fail. What I'm assuming in that is that I have complete control as a leader of the success or failure of that initiative. And that can be true. If we're building a house, then I can have complete control over whether or not it was successful based on executing the plan. But what we do is usually more complicated than that. There's a lot of more risks and a lot more unknowns in markets and disruptive technologies and segments that we're going into. So you have to really decouple the success of that from your individual success. And when you do, then you could say, okay, it's just an experiment, right? It's the Thomas Edison thing, right? I didn't fail. I just found 10,000 ways that didn't work, right? It's that same notion of, well, I'm still going to get there. I'm not giving up on getting there, but that wasn't the way. So what's another?
Do you think your engineering background and your spirit of curiosity helps you to have that mindset?
Tremendously. Don't get me on a soapbox there, but I think, there's statistics that a third of CEOs today are engineers. Engineers, and I'm generalizing, of course, but we grow up in an environment where everything's a puzzle. We go to college and we take classes where the average score out of 100 is a 42. And we celebrate getting a 57. We celebrate getting 43% of the answers wrong. We celebrate what we did get. And so it takes a degree of persistence and a comfort with trying things and not being successful the first time. Any engineer that's been successful their first time on everything they've done hasn't done a lot. Pick them. They've not really tested. They've not gone as far as they could go within the limits of their capability if they've never failed.
What do you think that process taught your team about humility and adaptability?
Again, that you can't possibly figure out how good you are until you really test it, and that it's okay to not be successful. Now, it's not okay to spend $5 million and have an epic failure. It's okay to go in and say, this $5,000 might not work out, but here's our plan and here's what we're going to learn, and let's follow up on that. So we talk about failing fast, and that sounds like a punchline, but what it is it's about the incremental nature of failure and learning versus huge bets, not going all in, right? If you're learning blackjack, you don't go all in on the first hand you ever play. You throw a dollar chip out there and you play around a bit, and your pots get a little bigger as you get a little more experience and a little more confidence. And so I think it's getting that comfort that the team has learned, okay, let's try a few things. We need to be clear on what we're doing and why we're doing it. But if we are, we're going to have the full support to iterate and try to get better.
And now, a brief word about our podcast sponsor. Lean Focus knows that the most effective way to improve the bottom line is through lean transformation. And although lean is most often associated with manufacturing, Lean Focus successfully applies the principles of lean thinking to new business growth, innovation, supply chain, mergers and acquisitions, human resources, and beyond. To enact lean transformations, Lean Focus uses the proven tools of the Lean Focus Business System, or LBS for short. To begin your journey of transformation, pause this episode and contact a senior-level LBS expert now at leanfocus.com. Now, back to the podcast.
This is the point in the story where the strategy becomes execution and you start to make some big bets. So it's the make or break moment of the transformation journey. So now you're committing to some long cycle bets. So you said your do or die moment was choosing to get strategic versus opportunistic, to invest in longer cycle development plans that demanded patience and courage. How did you convince the organization to prioritize those long-term bets over quick wins?
So anytime you're doing development the way we are, you end up with the trial process, right? Anybody that's making products, whether you call it the prototype process or the trial process, or it's software, it's your different releases and versions, right? You're getting something out there, and then you're going out for feedback. And if you do that well, you get 75-80% there, and you start building confidence with whatever your market or customers. Okay, you're on the right track. This is what we need to tweak. This is what we need to tweak.
Is there an example of a program or a product you can talk about that kind of fits this example?
One of the big things going on in the world today, we're all aware that labor is at a premium, right? And so if you're in the construction industry and you're trying to hire people, there's fewer that want to work, and they're a lot more expensive. So it's not a surprise. It's not earth-breaking. There's a lot of technology going into the building and construction industry to make it easier, faster to build a house. An example of that is adhesives, which we're involved in coating, right? So back when you and I were growing up, if you were going to put a floor in, or you're going to put a roof in with some kind of linoleum or tile, you would get this big 5-gallon drum, and you'd pour it down, and you'd have some form of a squeegee, and you lay it on. And I might use 5 gallons, you might use 8, our friend might use 2. It might all work. It might not be even when we're all done. There'd just be a lot of variation. And it'll probably take us a long time because none of us really knew what we were doing. What you're seeing today is, okay, buy a material, on the back of it, you pull a liner off, now it's sticky, you put it down, right? It's much faster. There's a very finite amount of material in there. It's very predictable, and it's much more systematic. So the LVT tile, right? And so in those kind of cases, our ability to make that product in a disruptive way at a cost performance point that others may or may not be able to do, we're building confidence that, wow, we can actually go after a construction application, and it's completely new business. Now they're not buying a 5-gallon drum of glue. Now they're buying our product. That's kind of cool, right?
What I like about that story, it really gives me a window into how your mind works, John. I don't know if you realize it, but you started from the external driver of strategy. You started with a market dynamic of less labor, higher cost labor, time to build a house. So that was the need or the pain point inside the market. Then you segmented that down to the construction industry, down to housing. I'm sure you sized that market opportunity, looked at the product offerings inside of it, and then you guys put some chips on black and said, hey, if we could do something in this space, and then you carry that forward and you actually test that idea with those end users, and you got that feedback as you're moving along. And I think that what makes a quote unquote risky bet less risky, because of the amount of scientific problem solving and PDCA that goes through the scientific method, going back to that, to de-risk what this big bet is.
Yeah, it's exciting. And we pick our partners in a way that they value that approach, and it helps them. It allows them to focus on what they're good at, and we can bring them a degree of value that they wouldn't have otherwise maybe been able to get.
Any advice you'd give to people who are transitioning into these long cycle bets, because the payoffs aren't immediate, right? So how do you keep sort of the wolves at bay, so to speak? They're looking for short-term results on some of these things.
No, that's the holy grail, right? I think we all wrestle with that every day. The things we do, and I think pragmatically any business does, is you have to have a portfolio of segments and applications, and you have to recognize that some are going to have shorter and longer sales cycles and development periods than others, and just try to have a balance there, right? Try to get enough out of the shorter cycle time, some of the key wins where you're learning a lot, you're iterating, you're able to build some um, sustainable part of the business, but don't give up on a few of the key strategic long-term ones. So be very careful and thoughtful about those. As much VOC as you can, as much kind of committed development partners as you can get to pull that off. I mean, I had a great example of that way back in the day, Paradigm, back in the mid 90s. And the company identified a couple of new technologies. At the time, it was Windows NT taking over Unix and some new CMOS technologies, and they couldn't find a home for it in their current platform. It was a compatibility issue, and they decided to go into a new market that they weren't in and see if they could test these technologies. And all the customers said, "You're late. Hewlett Packard's already got a solution. We're in bed with them. We can't afford the incompatibility." And we said, "Well, will you just talk to us and just help us do our best?" And they said, "Sure." And we got in these VOC cycles where they ended up telling us everything that was wrong with our competitor's product and all the things they wanted better. Um, 2 years after introduction, HP pulled that product off the market, and that today is the J750. They've sold over 6,000 units at an ASP of 500,000 to a million apiece. It was all about engaging the customers, understanding their pain, really getting development partners, and then some, pretty cool commercial agreements and structures to motivate them to stay with you, but not getting away from that VOC just because they say they're not going to buy from you. Kind of embrace that and say, well, why not? What is so good and what are some of the problems? And ultimately, you can really go from there.
I think a lot of times in these transformation stories, there's a propensity to try to go it alone, to do it with the resources or the team members that you have on staff. But you decided to bring in some outside experts to engage deeply with the team, and something clicked in that moment when you decided to do that, and that Magnum actually began to accelerate very quickly. So how did you use external partners to accelerate or compress the learning curve around what you're trying to do?
It wasn't really until about 6 or 9 months in, right, which was about the point where I had confidence that I really understood where the pain points were in the business, where the team was struggling, and where maybe some of the constraints were on the business. And so it was very thoughtful about specific folks that I'd worked with in the past, right? Lean focus we brought in, right? I didn't do it on month 1 or 2, right? It'd be really easy to say, well, we have to do a daily management thing, or we have to do a value stream map and figure out where the waste is and this and that. In some cases, the siren is blaring right in front of you, and that's exactly what you need to do right at the beginning. That wasn't the case here, as we said, right? The barn wasn't burning. There are incremental things we're going to do. We are going to do those things, but that wasn't the first one, right? So really stepping back and understanding, and where I really dialed in was we were struggling in R&D. We were struggling. We had these great opportunities, but we didn't really have the competency to actually develop what we knew was the big opportunity. Right. And so I went back into my network and found the people that could and would and wanted to do that with us. When you got into the actual operation, we actually weren't really ready to get into the daily management problem solving because the people didn't actually really have a stable foundation for the process to get a baseline. Think about it as standard work, right? We didn't even really understand what we were trying to do in a way that you could implement sustainable standard work and get a predictable result. And so knowing some of the key people in there that could really stabilize that process and get us to a foundation where that team started to feel confident. They felt like they were getting developed and invested in, getting to a point where they could build and grow off of, and confident now when the next new thing comes that, oh yeah, we can figure out how to do that, knowing that they have a support in the network. Those were kind of two of the big areas. And then as we drive growth, going out and just finding the best people in the industry that know where and how to look and understand what we're trying to do and say, yeah, I can get you there. I want to get you there, and bringing them on board. So there's kind of those three different dimensions. Again, only a year in here, but pretty big movements in a relatively short time without the bull in the china shop approach, with the team saying, yeah, that makes sense. Let's go there next.
Kind of at a high level, I subscribe to this idea that there's 3 types of cultures. And let me explain this a second. There's an emotional culture that makes decisions kind of based on emotion. Yeah, I don't need to go much into that. And then there's this intuitive culture who knows maybe the markets and segments and customers very deeply, has great partnerships, but I wouldn't describe what they're doing as scientific or data or fact-based, but very intuitive. And they can be successful. And all three of these can be successful, by the way. And the last one is a data-driven culture. And I don't think one is the right one, but I think you've described your approach as 80% numbers, 20% words, facts first, context second. So how did you get your leaders comfortable in operating in a data-driven environment and kind of, using that model? Did you think about like what the culture was? Was it a data-driven culture? Was it an intuitive culture? Was it an emotional culture? And where were you trying to shift them more towards?
Yeah. We're definitely not an emotional culture. The fundamental business, the magnet business, probably leans more intuitive at this point. And it's maybe 60-40, maybe 50-50, right? We have a lot of data to support our intuition, but we are the market leader there. We understand it. We have tremendous relationships, depth of experience. It's almost as though the data has become intuitive, right? The challenge was applying that to the new side where we didn't have the intuition, right? And that's where the shiny object comes in. It's like, wait a minute, usually this intuition works, and now it's not. What's the data telling us? And so it was kind of an intuition first, data second in the growth areas. And the shift was really, well, let's just turn that around a little bit. Let's start with the data and create what you might call intuition, but let's call it hypotheses or theories. And then let's go test those theories or intuition. And as they get right, our confidence starts to feel like intuition, which is something we're familiar with, right? So kind of the whole nature of validating, it's doing it in a context, and I'm kind of answering this out loud here, so to speak, but I think that's what it really is the reason the organization was so comfortable going there as quickly as we did is because there's a longing for an intuition, a longing for really understanding the market, and a recognition that, well, we do these things, we're starting to feel more and more that way. Now that they see the link between the data and the intuition, the data and the confidence, it becomes a little bit addictive. And so now there becomes that pull, which is what I think we're starting to experience.
Did you experience some of the typical emotions and challenges that you get when starting to put things in like KPIs and red and green and discussing standards and maybe setting higher expectations on some of those standards, and how do people react to that emotionally, and separating themselves from being a loser if it's red versus, it's not me that failed, it's the process that still needs improvement. So kind of how do you teach that, right? We kind of take that for granted because it's the makeup of who we are and kind of where we come from. But now you're having to start over and install that way of thinking inside of a new organization.
Yeah, I think we're still on that journey. I think, frankly, everybody, we have that change curve diagram that we use, right? And I think that the ability to get there, everybody's at a different point on that curve. The best we can do is create a culture where you don't have fear, right? So the best we can do is make sure that everybody sees that there's no negative consequence of being red, that actually that's when you get help. Sometimes you want help, sometimes you don't, as we all understand, but at least that you're not going to be alone when something's red, and that the group's going to rally behind it, that we have some real reason why what we're measuring and how we're measuring it, and then we recognize red as a stretch goal. So I think we're moving well along that culture. As I said, different people are at different points. One of the things we did that we didn't really talk about here, and has been something done at companies we've worked at together, and something we've done here at Magnum that's been helpful, is, we invest in our people by helping them understand kind of their default styles and profiles and things like that. And we actually went so far as to take everybody off site for a 2-day event, and we all shared kind of our profiles and implications, and really kind of put that out there, right? So everybody got to see all the positive side, and there's no good or bad, right? It is. And the power is in the team respecting people's comfort zones and understanding when you're making someone uncomfortable, and and more optimal ways to approach and engage everyone, particularly when we're stressed, because that's when we get put into a different place. And so really understanding us as individuals, but then as a team, what we need to be doing as a group to be the best we can be, that's really helped. And that's a long answer into the red, but it's a really important part, right? If you ignore the people part and just assume that, well, you should be okay with red, you're not going to get there, right? You really need to understand the people, and the group as a team needs to commit to, no, it's okay to be red. And I understand John feels this way when he sees that, and he's working on that. Here's what I can do to maybe make it a little easier for him to work on that when I'm with him in this situation, so that I'm not pressing him into the stress zone so quickly. And that becomes a cultural element as well, that it's the respect portion of that, right? It's the engagement portion of that, and having that as a fundamental value in the business that makes it safe to be read.
If I could put a headline on this transformation story, I think I would call it the culture of kindness and curiosity. And you've said yourself that the key to Magnum's transformation is very simple: be kind and be curious. That mindset now runs through your entire team. Didn't you think so?
Yeah, and we're getting there. Yeah, we're bringing more people in, but it's definitely there's no raised voices. There's a lot of really good engagement, and we are moving into a new facility that we're designing that even further promotes that, right? So we're creating entire ecosystems around that to ensure that we preserve that going forward.
So I, always think about values in action, and what are the values you want to have inside of a company. And for those listening that are maybe interested about how they can transition their organization to more of a culture of kindness and curiosity, what were some of those values that you really focused on with the team to drive into their daily behaviors and their day-to-day business decision-making skills?
Yeah, so it's huge part is this engagement mindset, and that comes from the ownership, being at Gemba, on the floor, figuratively and literally, but the sleeves rolled up. When there's a problem, what are we doing to help to provide the resources to the group so they can be successful? What are we doing to hire and support the best people that we can get? When people are sick, when people need time off, when there's something going on in their life, the beauty of being a company like ours is we're able to support that. We make the exceptions that we need to make to support our team when they need it. And when we need them, they're there to support us. You can do a lot when you start there.
Yeah. It's great. John, what's remarkable about your story is that it's not about fixing something that's broken. It's about reigniting something that's great. And you've shown what happens when a leader combines respect for legacy with the courage to redefine the future. So where can people who are listening to this connect with you to learn more about yourself and Magnum's journey?
So I'm kind of a LinkedIn junkie. So John S. Adams on LinkedIn, and you can just DM me there. A lot of what I've done and what I do is there, and there's a reasonable number of updates. That's the easiest way to do it. Look up Magnum and try to find us there as well.
And one piece of advice you would give to CEOs stepping into a strong but stagnant business?
Well, be kind and be curious, right? Listen a lot and really understand how they got there, because there is a lot. You can't build a business the way a business like these are built without a really strong foundation. And sometimes those footings, get a little weaker. They age. They find out what the core of that foundation is and try to come back to that and build upon that. You can't go wrong by taking the time to really understand and appreciate and value that foundation.
For everyone listening, this is what it looks like when a great company refuses to settle for good. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a leader who's ready to reignite their own business. And as always, stay focused and stay lean. John, I want to thank you. This has been a pleasure. It was great catching up. Wish you all the best success, and the spirit of your transformation story, be kind and be curious. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Lean Focus Podcast with host Damon Baker. Please subscribe to this podcast to be notified when a new episode is available. And please consider leaving a 5-star review to support our guests while helping us to spread the word about the power of lean thinking. Until next time.